We've got a very interesting topic this morning, and I think we're going to have a wonderful speaker. I'd like to introduce Gail Rubin. For those of you who don't plan to die, our speaker today will enlighten us on the finer points of not dying and what happens when you don't plan. Gail Rubin, the doyen of death, is the author of the award-winning book and host of the award-winning TV show, A Good Goodbye, Funeral Planning for Those Who Don't Plan to Die. Ms. Rubin is a certified thanatologist, that's a death educator, and certified funeral celebrant who creates memorial services that are all about the person who has died. She is a member of the Association for Death Education and Counseling and the International Cemetery Cremation and Funeral Association. As president of the Jewish Christian Dialogue of New Mexico, she helped start conversations across religions. She also brought the Death Cafe concept to Albuquerque. So let's welcome Gail Rubin. And Gail is having a drawing for one of her books, which she has a table set up after the program. If you're interested in getting more information, she's going to have a drawing for her book.
And the DVD of the TV.
And a DVD as well. So this is what she has us put our little card in. So if you'll fill out one of these, there are pens in here, and then drop your filled out card in here. Then we'll have the drawing at the end of the program.
Thank you, Paula. The 1979 film Being There starred Peter Sellers. Do you remember this film? A simple-minded man who was an excellent gardener. The film opens with him waking up, and that day, the old man, this mysterious old man who owns the townhouse in Washington, D.C. that he's lived in for his entire life, the old man has died. The housekeeper breaks this news to him. He doesn't know what to make of that. But he goes up and he sees the old man, and then he turns the TV on and there's an ad for Beauty Rest mattresses. Later that day, some attorneys come to the house. There is no record of Chance, the gardener, living there. And they say, do you have a claim? He has no idea what a claim is. So basically, for the first time in his life, he leaves this house and garden in Washington and goes out into the wider world. Now, lucky for him, he wears the old man's suit, so he looks like quite the dapper gentleman. Through a series of events, he winds up in a rich man's home, and the rich man, Ben Rand, has the ear of the President of the United States. And at this point, Chance has become Chauncey Gardner. And the president is asking Ben Rand his opinion on the economy. And then they ask Chauncey what his opinion is. As long as the roots are not severed, all is well. And all will be well in the garden, is his reply. First we have spring and summer, and then we have autumn and winter. And then we have spring and summer again. And the president and Ben Rand think this is just brilliant. And he reflects whatever people want to project onto him. Now, I know this was originally a garden club, but who here actually gardens? Okay. But all of us can appreciate the excitement we see in the spring when seeds start to grow, new life comes up out of the ground. We're so happy with the summer and the maturing of the fruits and vegetables of our labors. We rejoice in the harvest in the fall and that beautiful setup of everything out there. The food was delicious. And then comes comes the winter. And a lot of people don't want to think about the winter. But this is the cycles of our lives. We rejoice in the matchings, hatchings, and then there are the dispatchings that we kind of want to avoid. Benjamin Franklin, our great American sage, said the only two inevitabilities in life are death and taxes. And we're only slightly more inclined to deal with our taxes because we know we'll be around to pay the consequences if we don't. But with our own deaths, yeah, let somebody else deal with it. May I ask, how many of you have actually pre-planned your funeral? Just a few of you. Okay. There is a proverb, especially appropriate since we're here in this lovely church. The prudent person foresees danger and takes precautions, while the simpleton charges blindly ahead and pays the consequences. Yeah, it's the little ghosty thing back there. It's having a good time. Our lives are like that. We need to be prepared for today and what's coming tomorrow. Now, why are we so hesitant to talk about end-of-life issues? We can trace it to the terror management theory proposed by Dr. Ernest Becker. Here's some certified thanatology stuff for you. In 1973, he wrote his book, The Denial of Death, which won a Pulitzer in 1974. And in The Denial of Death, he writes out this framework that we as humans are the only animals that we know of that think in symbols and words. And we use that to control our perception of reality. And we know that we are going to die someday, and that thought terrifies us. So we generally try not to think about it because we don't like to be anxious any more than we have to be. Now, Jack Canfield, co-author of the Chicken Soup for the Soul books and a success guru, he often quotes some study, which I've never been able to find, that says that 2/3 of adults have low self-esteem. And it takes good self-esteem to be able to consider your own mortality. And there are figures that among the American population, only about 25 to 30% of people actually do advanced medical directives, do estate planning, wills and trusts, and do funeral planning. So I think it's that 1/3 that has the self-esteem that's out there planning. Now you guys knew what the topic was this morning and you came anyway. So raise your right hand. Bend your elbow, give yourself a pat on the back, saying, yes, I have the self-esteem. Turn to your neighbor, give him a high five, say, yes, we have the self-esteem. We are talking mortality today. Yes. Excellent. So I was not always the doyen of death. By the way, a doyen, anybody know the definition? It's a woman who's considered senior in a group who knows a lot about a particular subject, and that would be me when it comes to the party. No one wants to plan a funeral or memorial service. Check out the pearls. Doyens wear pearls. Pardon?
Deaf chicks wear skulls.
Yes, and I wear, yes, my fabulous skull belt. And boots. These are Lucchese boots. I was not always the doyen of death. I actually come from a background as a public relations professional and an event planner. And And it was second wedding where it was a Jewish Western wedding. I wore a red dress and cowboy boots, and we had a wonderful reception in a converted horse barn in the North Valley, and a swing band, and everybody had such a good time. I wanted to write a book about creative life cycle events and call it Matchings, Hatchings, and Dispatchings, about weddings, births, and deaths. And I got to write a column in the Albuquerque Tribune by that name, focusing on just local stories and features, and it was the columns on death and funerals that got the most reader response. And it told me there's a real need to be able to have this conversation. And humor is the way to actually attract people to that conversation, to break down that resistance, that anxiety, that terror management theory that's working in our subconsciouses. So I decided to focus on funerals. Thing was, I had never planned a funeral for anybody before, so I decided to pick on my father-in-law, Norm. Norm was getting up there in years, and he had had 3 open heart surgeries in his lifetime. And after the third one, it was a heart valve replacement. He was in a coma for 10 days. And when he came out of the coma, his doctor said, "You better get your affairs in order." And he was in his 70s at that point, and he had done financial planning, but he had not done any funeral planning. Terror management at work. So I volunteered. My husband and I went to French's to pre-plan for my father-in-law. And I was amazed how much information we needed that we didn't have. And I was really glad he was still alive to provide that information. And over dinner with my in-laws, Norm, sitting there, says, "Sure, I'll get you my social security number and the family history and my veterans papers, and I'm going to write my own obituary." I'm thinking, this is good, he's really into this. And then I look over at Myra, my mother-in-law. She's looking down at the roast beef and the mashed potatoes. She doesn't want to think about this. She doesn't want to talk about this. "No, Norm will live forever." No! But we got past that. And Norm actually lived for 3 more years. At the age of 82, he fell and broke his hip. You all know what that means, yes. 7 weeks of hospitalization. They did a hip replacement surgery. That was successful, but it was the beginning of a downhill slide. On the 3rd ER admission, when he was having trouble breathing, they said, "Look, we can't fix him." He was basically inhaling anything he ate or drank. So they admitted him on palliative care. And we all gathered, and we were all there. He was in for a week, and he died after on the 7th day. And it was midnight on a Tuesday after 7 weeks of schlepping back and forth to the hospital. You know what? We were exhausted. But we went to the funeral home the next day. It was easy. It was quick. My mother-in-law just put everything on her credit card. Think of the points, the miles. And she even said to me when we were done, "You know, I really didn't like it when you were pre-planning, but now when we needed it, I'm really glad it was done." So that gave me my mission. Just like talking about sex won't make you pregnant, talking about funerals won't make you dead. And your family really does benefit from the conversation. And this totally changed the course of my life from being a public relations professional into being the doyen of death. One of the things that I helped pioneer here in the United States is the Death Cafe movement. You may not have heard of this. This comes to us from the United Kingdom, from London. A guy named John Underwood, with his mother, who is a psychologist, adopted something that was originally called Café Mortel, started by a sociologist named Bernard Cretaz, who held these in Switzerland and France. And And it's a chance for people to come together and have a little coffee, have a little tea, eat some cookies or cake, and talk about whatever is on their hearts and their minds about mortality issues. I was the first person west of the Mississippi to hold a Death Cafe here in Albuquerque. And the first person actually was in Columbus, Ohio, Lizzie Miles, who is a friend of mine, and I actually got to meet with her. She held hers in July of 2012. I had mine in September. So two years ago. And since then, I've been holding these events on a fairly regular basis in various cafes around Albuquerque. And it's really interesting. You get strangers together to talk about mortality, death, their concerns. We're bringing death out of the closet to talk about what's on our hearts and our minds. And notice there are 4 main areas of discussion that you might break down into the material, the medical, the spiritual, and the funeral. So let me give you a little stories about each of them and things for you to consider. So let me just take a quick poll here. So only a few of you have done funeral planning. How many of you have done estate planning? You have a will or you have a trust. Okay, so a good number of you have already taken care of that. That's good. Some of the things that get talked about at the Death Cafe is about stuff. You know, we love our stuff. One woman said, I've got this artwork that's worth thousands of dollars, and I'm really worried that it's just going to wind up in a yard sale for $5. So what do you do about that? Well, you talk about, how many of you have children? Okay, and so you're planning on maybe your kids inheriting your stuff. So you want to let your kids know. No? They're not getting it. Give it to charity. Yeah. So, you know, make sure you've got a listing of your property and what the value is of specific items. If you're insuring stuff for thousands of dollars, you need to let your kids know, don't put this in a yard sale for $5, please. It's worth much more if you offer it to an art dealer or something. If you don't have a will, although many of you do, I did want to let you know that the state will distribute your assets in a particular order. If your spouse is still alive, your spouse gets all your stuff. If your spouse is deceased but you have kids, your kids get all your stuff. If you don't have kids, or they have predeceased you, let me check the rundown. I want to make sure I'm not skipping ahead. Okay, spouse, children. No surviving spouse or children, the surviving parents. Your parents, if they are still alive. If they're not alive, surviving siblings. If they're not alive, surviving grandparents. Why they put them after the siblings, I don't know. They're probably not around. And then if you have no living relatives and no will, the state gets your property. So if you don't want New Mexico to get your stuff, make sure you at least have a will. Medical issues is another big topic at the Death Cafe. And the physician aid in dying question is something that we talk about a lot. In fact, let me give you a little bit. Is anybody familiar with this? Just a few of you. Yeah. So here in New Mexico, in March 2012, Asia Riggs, who is a woman from Santa Fe who has stage 4 ovarian cancer, asked for a ruling, a judicial ruling, about the possibility of having physician assistance for a terminally ill patient to have assistance to achieve a peaceful death. And two oncologists, Catherine Morris and Ruth Mangalik, joined her in this suit, which, so they wanted a judgment that said that aid in dying for someone who's terminally ill, mentally competent, an adult, who could self-administer this kind of medication to achieve a peaceful death, that this would not be classified as a felony for the physician to do this. And in January of this year, Judge Nan Nash ruled basically in the plaintiff's favor, saying that...
Too late for Kevorkian.
Well, yeah, you know, he's dying. And by the way, did you know the guy who started the Hemlock Society just died? He was 98 years old. What do you think he died of? Old age is not a valid cause of death on a death certificate. He actually had a stroke, and the doctors wanted to put him on a ventilator. And can you believe that? And his son said no. They had had a conversation, so his son, and you know, given that he was the founder of the Hemlock Society, you'd think. Yeah. So Judge Nan Nash found that this would be a fundamental right for New Mexicans to have this right to get these medications. And right now, that means that patients in Bernalillo County, of course we're here in Sandoval County, but more about that in a moment, are free to talk to their physicians about aid in dying, and the physicians would be protected from prosecution. However, Attorney General Gary King has appealed this ruling to New Mexico Supreme Court. It's going to take years before it gets there, and if the ruling is affirmed, it would pave the way for physician aid in dying to be available for everybody across the state. If it is turned down or overturned on appeal, physicians would not be protected from prosecution in Bernalillo County and for providing physician aid in dying. There is no state order on the physicians in Bernalillo County for doing this right now, but they're waiting to see if there will be one. So right now, the doctors aren't really talking about this much. Dr. Mangalik came to one of my death cafes and made this great statement. He's like, doctors have been surreptitiously doing this for decades, you know. They'll write out a prescription for 50 Percocet and say, now don't take all of these at once or it'll kill you. But control. A lot of the people who come to the Death Cafe are generally baby boomers. I actually had a young guy in his 20s come to my last one. But a lot of people in their 50s, 60s, and 70s have been coming to this. And control over medical issues is a big issue that keeps coming up. And I would like to suggest to you, do you have a medical power of attorney, someone who can speak on your behalf? Should you not be able to? Very important to get that set up, and it's very easy to. So I'm seeing a bunch of hands going up, so good for you. That's all. Raise your hand, give ourselves a pat on the back. Yay! Another issue is spiritual. And, you know, this is one of the things about why the terror management theory, because we don't really know what happens beyond this physical lifetime. And some of the people who have come to the Death Cafe have talked about near-death experiences that they've had. And it's fascinating. One man, his heart had stopped beating. The circumstances leading up to it were just bizarre, so I'm not going to go into that. But while he was clinically dead, he went to this kind of gray, fuzzy netherworld and found himself in the presence of a divine being of light and love that some might call God. And he invited God to go have a beer with him. And they went to a walled beer garden, and he said, and I still remember the flowers. They were just brilliant, awesome colors, and so fragrant. And there were these monks at the gate to the beer garden. And they said, you can't come in. It's not your time. And whoop, he found himself back into his body, racked with pain. While he was out of his body, there was no pain. So we don't have to worry about pain when we die. And he shared that story, and so many near-death experience stories do involve some kind of being of light and love, and no pain, and something that is really awesome. I know the word awesome gets overused in this day and age, but the stories that we get from people with near-death experiences tell us that we have nothing to fear about death. That who knows what it is that we step into next, but in my opinion, our life here is a journey that doesn't stop when our bodies stop. The journey continues, and it's a great mystery. And of course, we talk about funeral planning. Funeral planning for those who don't plan to die. Who here thinks they want to be cremated? Show of hands. Wow. Ooh, you're probably about 80% of you here. Yeah. Anybody want to call out why you're inclined toward cremation?
It's cheaper.
It's cheaper, yes. That is one really big reason, yes.
Not taking up precious space on earth for burial.
Not taking up space in the cemetery. Yes.
Easy to carry, about 5 pounds.
Easy to carry, about 5 pounds. Yes, 5 to 8 pounds of cremated remains.
I'm claustrophobic in this life. I don't want to be in a box.
Claustrophobic. Don't put me in a box. Yes.
I hate the thought of rotting.
Hate the thought of rotting. Okay.
There's a lovely columbarium here.
There's a lovely columbarium here at this church. Okay.
And I have staff, and it's very peaceful. And I took my girls, and I said, I don't want to creep you out, but I want you to sit here and look at this, and know how much Robert and I love to see this. We've always been happy here, and this is where we want to be.
That's wonderful that you brought your daughters and sat them down and showed them how peaceful it is here in Placitas.
We can't hear that.
Yes, I just did. I'll keep doing that. Anybody else? Yes.
You can share my ashes amongst my loved ones.
You can just...
Little baggies. And then they can spread them or keep them. Whatever makes them.
So you can split up cremated remains among your family and friends. And speaking of little baggies, I do have some cremated remains here that I want to pass around. In case you haven't gotten up close and personal with any cremated remains, these are some of the remains of a teacher, a guy named John Ognevetti, and he is continuing to teach in the afterlife by letting people look at his cremated remains. So I'll just pass that around. The lid of the tin that he's in is the I Love Lucy crowd going on a trip. So, anybody else? Yes?
A question. I know in California it's illegal to spread ashes around.
It is not illegal to spread ashes in California.
Let's go with a company that does it in certain areas.
Okay, let's talk about some frequently raised questions about cremation. Do you know how many hundreds of people, if not thousands of people's ashes are scattered up there on Sandia Mountain? It's huge. In fact, as a celebrant, I actually went up there to help scatter some ashes for a girlfriend of mine. Her brother died, and she had, one of those little jars with, they had split up some of his remains. And she just felt bad about keeping his remains in a little jar on the table. So we hiked up. There's some springs up there, and we found some running water, and we actually scattered earth, air, fire, water, and let his spirit go. There are beautiful ceremonies that you can do with cremated remains, and one of the things about cremation is it does open up for a wide range of meaningful, memorable, creative services. With a funeral, you've got to bury that body within a week to 10 days. And, you know, green burial is another thing that I see a lot of interest in. Okay, those of you who don't plan on being cremated, anybody buried? Who wants to be buried? Ooh, not very many of you.
About the green burial, and I wanted to be cremated. I really like this idea.
Green burial is, you know, the thing about funerals is, in the traditional funeral sense, you know, there's embalming. That's just, they drain your blood, they put embalming fluid in the body, and, you know, nothing natural about that. Metal caskets, so many resources go into the ground with traditional burial. It's been said that enough metal in caskets and vaults goes into the ground, enough metal to build a Golden Gate Bridge every single year going into the ground. Enough concrete for liners to build a 2-lane highway from New York to Detroit every single year going into the ground. Now, I am on the cemetery committee for Congregation Albert, the Reformed Jewish congregation in Albuquerque. And we have like an extra acre that has yet to be developed. And we are looking at doing a green burial section within our new area that we'll expand into. And that means burying the body. And by the way, Jewish burial is naturally green burial, because as well as Muslim burial, which is very similar. We don't embalm because the blood is considered a part of the body to be buried with the body. We dress the body in cotton or linen clothing that's white. It harkens back to the high priests of the ancient temple, because in death we are all equal and we're all high priests. And the body is usually put in a plain pine or poplar box, some kind of soft wood, and then placed in contact with the earth. And in most cemeteries, they're going to require a polydome liner to go over the top. But underneath that polydome liner, the body, the clothing, the casket, all decompose into the earth at about the same rate. So that's the closest you can get to a green burial in a conventional cemetery. And a step further, there's a green conservation burial ground that's under development outside of Santa Fe, where you can be buried in a shroud, and this is what we're going to put in our new section, the green burial section, and return to the earth in that natural manner. Yes, ma'am?
If you do green burial, how do you manage the odor decomposition?
How do you manage what about?
The odor.
You're at least 4 feet underground. There is no odor that escapes.
Oh, the body is put in the ground?
The body is buried in the ground, yes. Yeah.
But they're not embalmed, they're buried.
Correct.
And then they decompose naturally.
Yes. Yes. What? I see you waving your finger. Oh, okay. Yes,
Are
ma'am.
the plots reusable?
When you do a green burial, not really. Yeah, that's your eternal resting spot. Yeah. Although you will find in cemeteries in Europe, in Italy, in Hungary, and a number of places, you get a 75-year lease on your resting spot, and then they move you out. But by then, you know, whatever generation would have known you, chances are, have passed on. Yeah. Yes, ma'am?
Another option is donation of the body to a medical facility.
Yes, and I love talking about body donation to medical facilities. You may have seen that news back in July about a gentleman who had signed papers to donate his body to UNM. He had cancer and he wanted people to benefit from research of this cancer that he had. But guess what? You need to have a plan B for body donation to a medical school because they were full up. They couldn't take him when he died. And the nice thing about donating to a medical school is they take the body, they do whatever they do with it, they cremate it, and then they return the remains to the family at no cost to the family. Now, if you're going to put an obituary in the paper, if you're going to have a memorial service, you have to pay for that. But that part of just getting rid of the body is free. But if UNM's medical school has got all the bodies they can handle, you need to have a plan B, and a plan B that I would suggest there are national services that do the same thing. But like MedCure and BioGift. So these are national organizations that work with local funeral homes to do the same thing. Pick up the body, take it, do what they do, and then return the remains at no cost to the family. Yes, ma'am?
My mother-in-law absolutely wanted her body to be donated to a hospital in Pittsburgh.
Mm-hmm.
She did not have a plan B. She died on the operating table, and they could not take the body. So that is another thing to make sure what the laws are. I don't know if that's national and in all states, but not only would a medical facility in Pennsylvania not take it, we also tried in another state where we were living at the time. We were going to send it back.
Oh, wow.
And they would not either. There was something, I guess it's a liability thing, that if you died on the operating table, they wouldn't.
Dying on the operating table will play havoc with your plans to donate your body.
So have a plan B for that one too.
Yeah, yeah.
It was something we didn't know.
Yeah. And there are certain circumstances where they won't take your body no matter what, which is infectious disease, HIV, AIDS, maybe hepatitis, depends. If the body is swollen, edema, or grossly underweight. So, you know, it's not a guaranteed thing. But cremation, at its most basic here in this town, you could get a cremation for just under $1,000, direct cremation. Now that's no services, that's no viewing the body. You do have the opportunity to pre-authorize your own cremation, which is a good thing. I don't know if you remember earlier this year there was a story about a young lady who knew she wanted to be cremated. She talked about it with her mother. She died under mysterious circumstances, and the funeral home would not allow her to be cremated because only her mother was around to approve it. Her father had never been a part of her life since she was a child. And they wanted both parents to sign off on her cremation. I mean, she was able to go to another funeral home, but funeral homes can be hinky about this. So if you are planning on being cremated, and as the drawing slips come around, I hope you're putting your email address on there, because I will send you a link afterwards to download the New Mexico pre-authorization form to self-authorize your own cremation. If you go to arrange with a funeral home, they may want you to fill it out again to basically use their form, but this is a state-sanctioned form. Also, I'll send you a link to download the Newly Dead game, which is like the Newlywed game, except the questions are how well you know someone else's last wishes. And it is the fun way to get the conversation started. So, my gift to you, as well as in doing the drawing. So, another thing about cremation is that you can do ceremonies before the body is cremated. You can have a funeral with the body and then have them cremated. There are a lot of different options for what you're going to do, and I would recommend some kind of ceremony to say goodbye to a person. One of the things that I hear a lot among my colleagues in the Association for Death Education and Counseling is when a family says, oh, we're not going to have a funeral. 6 months later, they're still having a hard time grieving and healing. These are ceremonies, it's not for the dead person, it's the people who are still alive, so that we can come to some kind of dot at the end of that sentence about that person. I did a project. I've done a project. I haven't done it this year or last year, but for 3 years in a row, I did my 30 funerals in 30 days project, where I would read the obituaries and look for really interesting sounding people or interesting sounding funerals. Let me tell you about the biker funeral. But one of them was a memorial service in a bowling alley bar. And I saw that in the obituaries. I was like, what's that about? So I went, and I have to tell you, I do ask permission to do stories about the person and the funeral before I would do that. You bet I did that with the biker funeral. And in this case, the man who had died, his wife said, we're not going to have a funeral for him. And it was the bartender at the bowling alley bar who knew the guy and knew that his friends would want to say goodbye to him. It was a female bartender. So she placed the death notice, coordinated the potluck lunch, set up a little memorial in the corner of the bar. And these people talked about this guy. He was a nice guy. I think maybe his wife didn't want to have a funeral because he spent too much time at the bowling alley bar. But these guys, he was a supporter of Camp Shaver for the YMCA, and he was a member of the Optimist Club, and there were friends who wanted to say goodbye to him. So they talked about him and some of the great things that he did, and they raised a toast at the end. And this was a very potent lesson for me that, the family might say, oh, we're not going to have a funeral, but the community needs to say goodbye to people. And I've had a girlfriend, her father died, she's like, no, it's just the immediate family, we're just getting together, we're not doing anything. I was like, but I want to support you. So be open to the support of your friends and your family when there is a loss. Any other questions? Yes?
Do you remember Harold and Maude? They met by going to funerals?
Yes.
They used to bring their bag lunches to funerals?
In fact, usually what I do in a lot of talks is use funny film clips to illustrate various elements of funeral planning, talking about cremation. I've got a really hysterical collection of film clips called Ashes to Ashes, Dust in Your Face. Cremation, comedy, and creativity. But since I wasn't sure if we had the AV equipment here, so I'm just talking. And any other questions? Yes, ma'am.
Could you mention what the rules are for burial at the Santa Fe National Memorial for Veterans?
Yes, Santa Fe National Cemetery. You need to have one person in the family be a veteran and have those veterans' papers that indicate their service. And that gives the veteran and their spouse the right to a burial plot or a cremated remains niche if you want to go that route. It will not pay for the funeral services, but you do get a plot and a marker and the opening and closing of the grave and a service in the cemetery. So for those who have served our country as a member of the military, it's a great benefit. And by the way, if you have had people who were in the military but buried in a private cemetery, you can get the marker from the government to mark their resting spot for free. If you've already gotten a marker for them privately, but you still want to have indication of their service, there's now medallions that you can order and attached to the headstone. And those are free also. You just need to go on the va.gov website, and the information's all there. Yes?
My understanding Santa Fe is full. They're planning an expansion, but it's full right now.
I hadn't heard that. And by the way, the biker funeral. I should tell you about the biker funeral. Okay. So this guy, his name was Freddie Drake. And Freddie was about my age. He was in his mid-50s. And he had grown up with motorcycles. And the obituary in the newspaper, Freddie basically bit the dust when he was riding his motorcycle on the interstate and had an unfortunate accident with a truck. And the Banditos Motorcycle Club was supporting the family and basically hosting this funeral. And afterwards, they were going to take his body to the National Cemetery from Albuquerque to Santa Fe, doing a motorcycle ride. And I was like, okay, I have to go to this one. And indeed, there were about 78 Harley-Davidson motorcycles parked around the funeral home. And this is where I said, okay, I definitely am getting permission to write about this one. And I talked to his daughter, and she said, sure. So there are people wearing Freddie Drake Memorial t-shirts. There are motorcycle mamas with their muffin tops peeking out over the tops of their jeans. There are big burly dudes with lots of beards and facial hair and tattoos and the colors on their jackets or their vests. Banditos Motorcycle Club. And Freddie was actually a Navy veteran, and his body was in a closed casket, and people from various clubs were going up and putting stickers on his casket from the various clubs. And it was amazing. There were pews like these, and I go in and I sit down next to this one like really big burly dude. He's got tattoos all over him. There's on the side of his neck is a diamond with the number 1%. And I was like, oh, what's that mean? And he looks over at me out of the corner of his eye, smiles enigmatically, and then gets up and walks across to the other side of the chapel. He wanted to get as far away from me as he could. And I go home and I was like, honey, what's the 1%? This is not the 1% economically that we're thinking of. Back in the 1960s, the president of the American Motorcycle Club said that 99% of motorcycle riders are law-abiding citizens. This was the 1% who was not, and he probably killed somebody to get that tattoo. So, it was quite an experience. A woman sang Amazing Grace to the tune of the House of the Rising Sun. It was great, yeah. There was a photo montage of Freddie through the years in all of his different t-shirts and his multiplying tattoos. And it was a celebration of this man's life. And then afterwards, the hearse was a motorcycle trike pulling a glass hearse box that they put his casket in, and then all 78 of these Harley-Davidson motorcycles took the back road from Albuquerque up to Santa Fe for his burial. What an awesome send-off is that? So, how are we doing on time? Okay, well let me finish up. We talked a little bit about Benjamin Franklin and his wise words about death and taxes. And I want to finish with this. Oh, has everybody filled in their drawing slip? Should we do the drawing now, or do you want to do it after I finish up?
Go ahead and finish.
Okay. So consider these words from Benjamin Franklin that were spoken in his later years at the funeral of a friend. We are spirits. That bodies should be lent us, while they can afford us pleasure, assist us in acquiring knowledge, and in doing good to our fellow creatures, is a kind and benevolent act of God. When these bodies become unfit for these purposes and afford us pain instead of pleasure, instead of an aid become an encumbrance, and answer none of the intentions for which they were given, it is equally kind and benevolent that a way is provided by which we may get rid of them. Death is that way. Our friend and we were invited abroad on a party of pleasure which is to last forever. His chair was ready first, and he has gone before us. We could not all conveniently start together. And why should you and I be grieved at this, since we are soon to follow and know where to find him? The only inevitabilities in life are death and taxes. A prudent person foresees danger and takes precautions, while the simpleton charges blindly ahead and pays the consequences. So let me help you plan ahead for that inevitability. Talking about sex won't make you pregnant. Talking about funerals won't make you dead. Use your experience here this morning with this talk to help get the conversation started at home. Thank you.